Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Kinky Christian Podcast. I'm Pat.
And I'm James, and we're going to explore Christianity and kink and how and when they intersect.
So hold on for the ride. All right, beautiful people. Welcome back to another episode of the Kinky Christian Podcast. With me again today is my good friend James. Say hi, James.
Hi, James.
Today, we are going to be discussing something that's really important, not just in the lifestyle, but I mean, in the scenes. It's one of the big three, communication. And with communication, there's negotiation. Now, you're thinking, okay, what does negotiation have to do with kinky sex? James is going to explain that to you.
Oh, everything. Literally everything. Negotiation should be practiced every scene all the time. But there should be, typically, like in any kind of relationship, there's always negotiations because one party wants one thing, the other party wants maybe that exact same thing, but maybe something slightly different. So then you come to a point of negotiation. What I wanted to talk about, though, is the communication aspect of it. Communication is probably the most critical thing in everyone's life because how we interact with literally everyone else depends on our communication and their communication.
And communication ain't just verbal either.
No.
I mean,
There's plethora of ways. Actually, I think only a small percentage of the communication that we perceive is verbal. Most of it is nonverbal. So if our brains are already wired to catch more nonverbal than verbal, it would be folly to discount nonverbal communication in preference to what we generally consider communication.
And I think a good example of just that is how many times have you text someone and you got no bad intentions at all, but what they perceive coming across that text is not what you meant for them to perceive.
Correct.
And one, and that's, I think, probably why texting is one of the worst ways to communicate, but you don't have body language. So that right there, that's huge. I think body language says a lot because even if I'm communicating with you verbally, but I'm standoffish or I'm not smiling, facial expressions, I can say the kindest thing in the world, but my body's going to tell you something different. So, I mean, I think you're right. Verbal communication is just a small percentage of the way that we communicate with each other. I think there's a lot of, I guess, like you said, nonverbal ways to do it. And I think that's why we created emojis.
Well, I was going to talk about the lack of punctuation in text, possibly being one of the reasons that you don't get any kind of emotion through it. But also, I want to bring up another anecdote. I obviously, you've mentioned several times, I'm a barber. I had a guy come in within the last couple of days. I started cutting his hair, and I was in my zone. And so, typically when I start a haircut, I'm very focused and I don't talk much because setting the base is the most important part. And he then midway through the haircut, I start talking to him, and he was like, "Oh, good. I thought you were just going to be a dragon. You weren't going to say anything the whole time." And I was like, just because my nonverbals were saying that I did not want to talk to him, even though I was only focusing, and I would have talked to him if he'd have opened up and talked to me. But because of the situation, he felt uncomfortable due to lack of communication. I was thinking something very different than what he was thinking. So there was already a breakdown in communication before we even communicated.
And there was no texting involved.
Nothing. It was just nonverbals, and he perceived this thing, and I was perceiving this thing, and that just something as innocent as that is a breakdown of communication. Now, put that into a relationship where you're with a person for years and years and years, and context gets way out of whack.
It does.
Without communication, 25 years later, you don't know who that person is.
Exactly. I agree 100%. And on the flip side of that, with good communication, me and my wife have been married for 33 years now, I think. And she'll correct me if I'm wrong, trust me. But you get to a point where you've communicated so well for so long that the verbal communication is almost unnecessary. The prime example, I can't count the number of times per week that I'll say, well, I was thinking Oriental for dinner. And she's like, that's exactly what I was thinking. Just last night we went out and had Oriental for dinner to sum it up. But we got home and I'm like, you know what? I'm feeling like some ice cream. And she's like, I was just getting ready to ask you if you wanted to go get some. So good communication leads to such a good relationship.
A symbiosis.
Symbiosis. That's the perfect word for it.
One person will know what the other person is thinking.
Yeah, that is the perfect word for it, is symbiosis. And when you're in a intense situation, I'm going to kind of bring it back around to the negotiation part now. You want to make sure that you communicate well ahead of time. You don't want to try to get into any kind of anything. And then, especially like, let's say if you're in a scene, you're doing a scene and it's an intense scene, the floggers are flying, your slave or sub or whatever you're using, your partner is just in the zone, you're in the zone, and then you pull out the riding crop. And this is not something you negotiated ahead of time, but man, it felt right at the time. And you hit that butt with that riding crop, and now all of a sudden, that's not what they wanted. They were not prepared for it because you never negotiated that at the beginning that said, there's a possibility that this may come into play. Now, because of that lack of communication at the beginning, now that scene that was going so well and everyone was just riding this high is now falling off the cliff, And so you don't want to have to stop midway. You're saying, well, to prevent that, why don't you just tell them the crop is coming? No, you don't want to stop midway and then try to renegotiate what you already negotiated and communicated at the beginning.
Right.
So negotiation and communication are like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly.
You got to have them both. And that's in anything. And that's not, I use a saying just because, we're a kinky sex Christian podcast, but it's that way in life.
Well, that's the thing. Lessons on communication and negotiations don't just apply to this life. If you become a great communicator, which is why communications is an entire major you can have in college. Like 4 years you spend learning about communication. Without good communication, it makes everything else in life so much harder. So communication and negotiation aren't just a lesson for this, they're a lesson for everyday life.
Every aspect of life.
Yes.
And when you think about it, everything's communication.
Correct.
We're communicating now not just with each other, but we're communicating with our audience. When you watch the news, they're communicating with you. When you go to work, they're communicating with you. So every part of your life, you deal with communication. And anyone who has a job knows that poor communication can lead to some disastrous results.
Yes.
Depending on what job you do, you could kill somebody. Some lives could be, in jeopardy because of poor communication. Even within the lifestyle, if you're not communicating well, you could, if you're playing with e-stim or something, and someone's got a pacemaker or whatever, and you jolt that thing too hard. I mean, who knows? I mean, I'm not saying it'll happen, but it's just, it's so important, so important.
Well, an example of this would be shibari suspension or any kind of rope
Oh,
suspension. If you don't communicate, if you have a limb that starts to tingle and
yep,
you ignore it for a while, all of a sudden now it doesn't tingle anymore.
yep.
Oh, that's fine. No, it's not.
No,
Like
you've done lost
we're
blood flow now.
right.
So,
We're in an issue now, and so excellent communication, over communication even is a very good thing.
yes, I mean, I stop and you talk about shibari, but there's fire play, very dangerous. There's people, in these are not my kinks, but there's people who like, blood. They do things with blood, and it is very important, people, that when you're in a scene that you have negotiated up front what that scene is going to look like. I mean, it doesn't have to be the step by step of what's going to happen, because a lot of doms or tops, they like to, kind of surprise their subs with different things, but there needs to be a communication that says, okay, are you okay with XYZ? And if you're not, then that needs to be said ahead of time. So if they ask, are you okay with fire play? You need to say yes or no.
Right.
Are you okay with bondage? Well, no, I'm not okay with rope, but I'm okay with handcuffs. I mean, because that's a big difference, it's huge. Some people just don't like the feel of rope. I mean, it's negotiation and communication. Communication is one of the pillars for me,
Absolutely.
you know, and along with consent and connection, you got to have those things to really make anything work, and not just in the lifestyle. You need consent, connection, and communication through your whole life with everything.
Right.
If I came to you and just said, James, just cut my hair, that's not going to get us anywhere.
Not enough information.
There's no information. There wasn't enough communication. And then if I did not know ahead of time that I was going to pay you, and I just couldn't walk out, there was no negotiation ahead of time. So there has to be all of this in life. It doesn't matter if you're in the lifestyle, in a scene, doesn't matter.
Well, like I said earlier, everyone has a lifestyle. But even if, like, let's say 2 years from now, you decide to get out of this lifestyle, learning how to be an effective communicator will still be a great tool for you. It'll still be a
Correct.
great asset.
Correct.
One of the things my wife and I do, we try to do as regularly as we can. Typically we like to do it once a week. Is we sit down and we have a discussion about the tough stuff, like what's going wrong, like what have we fought about, like what issues are you having in the relationship, in life, in everything. What's going on with you? Where are you right now? And we sit down and we block everything else out. And we have a rule that we can't argue, we can't fight, we just communicate.
That is such an amazing thing, because just the fact that you do that, because part of communication is not only talking, it's listening.
It's got to be listening.
How many couples do you know? Because I know in my life, there's not many that can sit down and say, okay, honey, tell me what's going wrong. Because as soon as a woman tries to tell their husband, or vice versa, that this is what's going wrong, most people get defensive.
Defensive automatically.
Because they're not hearing what's being said.
And that's an issue where they're listening to respond rather than listening to listen. And so we need to shift our mindset and stop listening to respond and listen just to listen.
Yeah.
And to hear the other person.
Exactly. 100% agree. I am so glad you brought that up, because and I'm guilty of it myself. We all are. I'm hoping I do better as I go, but that's for my wife to decide. But when I was young, I was a hothead, and when people would approach me about something, I wasn't trying to hear what they were saying. I was already formulating my response in my head on how I'm going to prove that they were wrong.
Right.
You know, whether I was right or not didn't matter. I wanted to prove them wrong. You don't tell me that, yeah, that my blue jeans are too blue. They're exactly the right color. You know what I mean? And I think if we were to sit and listen to hear the other person, and our intent was not to come back at them with anything, but to ask more questions, get information, and understand that chances are their intent was to help. You know, I highly doubt most people, and I could be way off base on this, say something, especially to their spouse, just to try to, piss them off.
That's typically when contempt or a very negative emotion is entered into that relationship. Then they'll do those.
Then they'll do
things.
it. Yes.
Right.
But if they're just like, hey James, you left your clothes on the floor. Well, I don't think she's trying to attack you. I think she's reminding you that, you left your clothes on the floor. Or, you didn't put your dishes in the dishwasher, or what have you. Now there is a point of nagging, don't get me wrong, but to sit and listen to the other person, and what I have discovered by doing that is there's usually something more to it than, and that's why when you say, you sit down and say, okay, now what are we fighting about? What happened this week? And then you guys can discuss, okay, well, we fought about this. Okay, well, why did we fight about it? What was it that triggered that response that we fought about it? Did you have a bad day? Did she have a bad day? Was it really worth fighting about, or is there more that needs to be discussed about it? Mm-hmm. And taking it that in a positive way, as a constructive thing, instead of a negative attacking way. Mm-hmm. I just think that's amazing.
So what we learned through doing this is, now when we'll start into a fight, instead of like the fight escalating, one of us will stop and say, hey, sorry, this is because of this, this, and this. Because typically what we found is when we're having a fight, it's usually not about what we're fighting about. We don't really, yes, maybe some people leave stuff out on the countertop and don't put it away, and the dogs get into it occasionally.
That doesn't happen at your place, though, ever.
But when we have the fight, it's usually not about the fact that the dogs got into it. It's usually about, hey, I had a stressful day. Like, something happened in my day that changed it dramatically. I was having a good day, and then I had a bad day, and now I'm here, and now you're getting the ramifications of my bad day.
Right.
And as humans, it's so hard to shut out the rest of our lives as we have a relationship with one person. But typically that would be the only fair thing to do. The person you're having a relationship had nothing to do with the other factors in your life, But
exactly.
You come and you'll take it out on them, or they'll take it out on you. Like, nobody's innocent on this.
No.
Everybody has done this.
Everyone's done it.
So if we can preempt those fights and say, hey, I had a rough, stressful day, I'm touchy, or I deal with a lot of pain. So on certain days I'll be in more pain. I'll have more of a hair trigger than I would on other days. So I can be like, hey, sorry, I'm in a lot of pain. I know I'm snapping and yelling at you guys for things that are happening, but it's because of this.
Yeah.
And that's only through strengthening the communication is where you get to that point.
Yep.
But when you strengthen the communication, you also strengthen the trust. Every time you strengthen your communication, your partner will have more trust in you because it's honesty.
And that's huge. That is huge. And then the more you trust, the more open you become, so the more you communicate, So, yeah, it's just perfect. That is just perfect. So, keep in mind, we're not experts on anything. We
Except
share.
barbering.
Yes.
I'm an expert on that.
We share with you guys what we have learned through our experiences through life. And what's great about having James here with me is he has experienced so many things that I haven't. So having him here to help communicate to you guys and to me, his experiences shows just, how important communication is, because you can learn from someone else's experiences. And the only way you're going to learn is if you communicate with them and you're open to hearing them, what they're saying.
And you listen.
Yeah. And that's a big thing. That's one of the keys is listening is almost more important than talking when you're communicating.
Particularly for a dominant. And it's not just listening. Again, going back a few episodes, in a scene, you're watching for those nonverbal communications. You're judging their breathing. You're looking at their skin to see how red or how
warm it is.
Well, we get into deep bruising and whatnot like that. Yeah. You're watching all of these factors all at once.
And it's all part of communication.
Yeah, their body is communicating to you. I mean, it's if you're paying attention, you can figure out a whole lot more.
Yeah, and if you're not paying attention, you shouldn't be a dom.
Correct.
And that's another thing people need to know. Don't fall for them posers out there that think they're doms and they're frauds. But we'll talk about that in another episode. But communicate, people. Communicate, negotiate. Like James mentioned before, you negotiate all through life. You negotiate. When you got married, there's negotiations. And a lot of it, you don't even realize it's a negotiation. It's not like you have to sit down and write out a contract. You can if you want. I know couples that do. They, have a contract that's for their relationship. But you just negotiate, Me and my wife, I know what my part in our relationship is, and she knows what her part is. But it took us a while to get there, and we wouldn't have got there without communicating. Sometimes we communicated poorly, and even though you communicate poorly, you can learn from that.
Sometimes you communicate loudly.
And sometimes the nonverbal communication comes in the form of a shoe,
Or a finger.
Or a finger.
You never know.
You never know. There's so many forms. So just keep the lines of communication open both ways. Always listen with the intent of hearing and understanding. Always ask questions. Always confirm what they're saying. Don't hear what they're not saying. That's a big thing. Do not hear what they're not saying. If you're unsure of what's being told to you, confirm with them.
Correct. Any kind of ambiguity. Don't allow for ambiguity. You if you're not sure, ask another probing question.
Yep. Always ask. Don't assume. So keep that going. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions for future episodes, communicate to us. The easiest way to do that, in fact, right now, the only way to do that is through email, and that's the Kinky Christian Podcast at gmail.com. So we look forward to hearing from you. Till then, stay safe, take care of each other, and God bless.